It's no secret that I'm a mega fan of horror, but my favorite subgenre is one that is often unfairly maligned for the worst of its films. Umbrella statements are made too frequently, and unfair conclusions are reached by assumption. So today, I hope to shed light on the wonders and, yes, shortcomings of the deliciously violent and deliriously fun slasher subgenre. I'll begin with where it began. There's been a lot of debate around what the first ever slasher is, the two most common opinions being Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, both released in 1960. The thing is, I don't really have any strong feelings about either of these movies, and they've both been examined to no end by a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am. So instead, I'll start with an early slasher I actually give a shit about, Black Christmas. While many of the so-called first slashers ever made all came out in the early 60s, Black Christmas is still considered a fairly early slasher, despite having been released in 1974. This is due to the fact that not many slasher films were made between those early days of Hitchcockian kills at the Bates Motel and Black Christmas in '74. The slew of cheap slashers we often laugh upon today were from the late 70s and later. Black Christmas's popularity, in fact, is what I believe began the slasher craze. Many claim that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre set off this infatuation, but the myriad of movies that followed had a very tight formula, much closer to the pacing and execution of Black Christmas. This is by no means to say that Texas Chainsaw wasn't incredibly influential to the subgenre. On the contrary, it encouraged the more gritty and grindhouse elements popularized by Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left to be used in less exploitative films. It just doesn't serve our current purpose of examining the format of slashers. Here's what Chelsea Rebecca and James A. Janice from the Dead Meat podcast had to say about the Texas Chainsaw as a founding slasher.
Texas Chainsaw kind of laid a lot of the groundwork for that, even though it doesn't fit as neatly into the definition of maybe what we think of as a slasher.
It's just, in my mind, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is separate from those others. I'm not even sure if I would call it a slasher. Would you?
I don't think no, I don't think I would, but I think you don't have slashers without it.
For sure, of course. And it can be kind of a slasher, It's everything's everything to some degree.
With all this made clear, let's begin to explore Black Christmas. Originally titled Silent Night, Evil Night, Black Christmas capitalized on the serial killer fascination spread by the Manson family killings in the early 70s. Its plot, loosely based upon the series of real-life murders perpetrated by Wayne Bowden during the holiday season, is pretty cut and dry. After a sorority house receives a number of anonymous lascivious phone calls, its members begin to go missing. Black Christmas is very simple and very good. It utilizes its small budget to perfection, crafting and developing interesting characters and creepy scenarios, only to kill nearly everyone in gruesome and disturbing ways. This is where a slasher format is at its best, giving us an easily digestible plot and pacing so that its horror set pieces and skin-crawlingly murderous antagonist can shine, free of fanfare. For those of you who are unaware, the slasher format is as follows. A murderer kills innocents at an increasing rate throughout the film, until only one or two of our protagonists are left. In the finale, these protagonists then have a standoff with their tormentors, a battle between good and evil, innocence and depravity, that rarely leaves both alive. Black Christmas has a singular departure from this formula. The antagonist is misidentified and never actually seen, his fate and identity left unclear. Ironically, this variation is the most talked about part of the film, despite being the single aspect that wasn't consistently copied and restyled in the coming decades. Even more ironically, the 2006 remake explored the identity and backstory of our previously mysterious killer, forever ruining the most memorable moments in the original. If I suddenly gained the ability to travel through time, my first goal would be to wipe this horrendous mockery of an origin story from existence. Then, I would move on to less important tasks, like preventing historical tragedies. Black Christmas is, in my opinion, a relatively perfect slasher, so let's move on to the overbearingly imperfect. As I previously mentioned, an onslaught of shitty, low-budget slashers began pouring out of sub-Hollywood orifices after Black Christmas and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out in '74. Slashers were the preferred cash grab subgenre because fake blood is cheap, and that's about all you need in the way of physical resources to make a slasher. It's like how today, filmmakers with little to no money or talent simply rely on the found footage subgenre. Countless so bad they're good classics came out during the late 70s and early 80s, some of my favorites being The Ice Cream Man, Hide and Go Shriek, Blood Rage, and Chopping Mall. Intentional comedies have nothing on these masterpieces of cinematic failure.
You smell like pepperoni.
Well, if that's the way you feel.
Wait a minute.
What?
I like pepperoni.
Oh. In that case.
My favorite of them all, however, is without a doubt Pieces, a film that follows a murderous necrophiliac as he pieces together a perfect woman using body parts from his victims. Whatever you're thinking, it is worse in every way. It somehow manages to encompass all the sleaze and transgressions that this era of money-grubbing movies has to offer, which is exactly why I'm covering it in this video. Pieces begins with an origin story of sorts, showing our antagonist, as a child, killing his mother after she finds him piecing together a nude puzzle. Many movies at the time attempted to provide a reason for their killer's insanity, some to flesh out the character for narrative purposes, others to make some sense of the senseless violence so prevalent in non-fictional media at the time. Regardless of the widespread reason, Pieces uses this cold open format to establish the sleaze and immaturity of what's to come. Whether this is a rare moment of insight or simply a show of the film's ineptitude is unclear, but the effect is the same. We are prepared for the gratuitous nudity and gore to follow. Pieces truly is gratuitous. It has no regard for tone or sensitivity, suddenly exposing women and cutting out innards at the worst of times. For example, the first on-screen present-day murder is preceded by a high schooler skinny dipping. When she sees the killer, she reacts to his presence by arching her back sexually. The movie doesn't stop being so lavish in its portrayal of female nudity once the bodies are cut open and torn asunder. On the contrary, it highlights dismembered breasts and bloodied waists, clothed only by the organs spilling out from women's stomachs. Many films at the time were equally exploitative. Money-crazy filmmakers with no reputation to lose realized that teens, the primary viewers of horror movies, react most strongly and gutturally to violence and sex. They pumped these elements into everything they made, birthing the intense wave of misogyny in 80s horror that was at first propagated and then criticized by the rape-revenge subgenre. That's a subject for another video, but the underlying message being portrayed by the majority of low-budget horror movies at the time was that women were purely sexual creatures, without personality, without agency, without strength. Female characters would be shown in sexual situations, often nude, and then killed, often in search of a man to protect them. The misogyny didn't end behind the camera, either. The director noted in the special features that every woman with a nude scene had to strip and have their bodies inspected as a part of their auditions. This trend of over-sexualized victims continues throughout the movie until its conclusion. The whodunit aspect falls flat, and the killer is revealed to be a character we've barely met. This, while not typical of low-budget slashers, is typical of low-budget giallo films. On rewatch, I noticed that Pieces stole much of its mystery from Joe D'Amato's classic, What Have You Done to Solange? For example, both films star a teacher falsely accused of murdering a student for sexual pleasure. Here are the teachers from both films, side by side. After the killer is murdered quickly and bloodlessly in the film's only use of restraint, the hero rejoices, but his celebration is premature. The titular pieced-together woman made from an assortment of corpses falls out of a wall and lands right on him. They get it in a body bag for some reason? I mean, it's evidence, right? Why do they have it in a... It doesn't matter. All seems calm again until the Frankenstein's fuck doll reaches up and scrapes off our protagonist's dick. What? Since when was this movie Oh, it's over now? Okay. This was yet another redundancy in shitty slashers. They had to end with a punch, a final scare, but then they were over, so the writers had no obligation to the rest of the plot. They would throw in the most batshit crazy and wild ending, just to milk out every last bit of adrenaline they could. The intent of the cheap thrill was to leave the viewers with a positive impression of the film's scares, but this lackluster technique of plot destruction simply feels unsatisfying and trashy. The whole movie is undeniably terrible, but despite this, admittedly fun. I would argue that while this is a bad film, it indirectly succeeds at its goal of flimsy exploitation through laughs rather than scares. Low-budget slashers aren't all bad, though. Grindhouse slashers use the little money they have to create a gritty and grimy atmosphere, further unsettling the viewer. This technique was so successful that it spawned some of the most beloved slasher classics ever made. Let's take a look. Starting with some of the more famous Grindhouse slashers, the original Halloween and Friday the 13th both had extremely low budgets. Halloween was allotted $325,000 in today's money, while Friday the 13th was given $550,000. This may seem to be a considerable amount of money, but just compare it to some averagely budgeted slashers. Take Hellfest, which came out in 2018 and had a budget of $5.5 million, nearly 17 times the budget of Halloween. And this isn't just an issue of times changing. Scream came out just 18 years after Halloween, yet had a budget of $15 million. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Hellraiser are more examples of now-famous slashers celebrated for their ability to deliver some of the best scares in film history without a great deal of money. Texas Chainsaw, for example, had to use countless tricks and cheats to save themselves money. In this scene, the director, Tobe Hooper, couldn't pay for a stunt driver, so he just had the truck drive away from the actor and then played the clip in reverse. In this rather infamous scene where a disabled character is killed with a chainsaw, Hooper wanted blood to shoot up at the killer, Leatherface, but didn't have any blood tubes. So Hooper and a PA knelt down on either side of the wheelchair and spat fake blood up at Leatherface. That blood there is coming out of their mouths. And Hooper had to save money any way he could because Texas Chainsaw Massacre was financed by the Mafia. You heard that right. The Mafia paid to make Texas Chainsaw Massacre as a form of money laundering, using the money they made with the notorious porn film Deep Throat that came out 2 years earlier. The FBI actually tried to shut down the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and ban it nationwide. Thankfully, they did not succeed, and it remains one of the most influential horror films ever made. Modern grindhouse horror films typically focus all their money on gore and blood effects. Think Drive, The Human Centipede, or the Hostel trilogy. The art of grindhouse horror has changed from conservation of money and resources to shock and gross-out exploitation over the last few decades. Please be mindful that I don't make this observation scornfully. Using reactionary techniques properly is a talent, and one that has no reason to be dismissed as cheap. I would show an example to prove my point, but that would likely get this video taken off of YouTube. If you want the full example of shock and gross out done right as an art form, check out Kusa, which nearly made me throw up. It's streaming on Shudder, and I honestly believe that it is the most disgusting film ever made. Another phenomenal contemporary slasher is Terrifier, a rather plotless film following an undeniably creepy and murderous clown as he goes on a killing spree. Objectively, this is a bad movie. The characters are inconsistently written and poorly acted, the dialogue is laughable.
I have a little more self-respect than that.
If you only had a brain.
Oh, gotcha.
I've been wanting to use that one all night.
Congratulations.
And there's a weird, unnecessary plot development towards the end that was not set up whatsoever. But despite that, Terrifier is a deeply horrifying film that will leave you with nightmares and irrational fears for days to come. This is because, in my opinion, it masters the art of gore. The writer, director, producer, and special effects artist, Damien Leone, completely ran the show here, creating a blank canvas on which to paint his disturbing myriad of grotesque set pieces. He uses his impressive expertise to elicit a strong response from his audience that he certainly earns. The idea that anyone familiar with his work would consider his techniques cheap is frankly unfathomable to me. This film, and the larger group of similarly themed masterpieces it represents, while flawed and deeply imperfect, are admirable achievements that take skill and talent. Yet for some indiscernible reason, the entire art form of intentional gratuity is widely deemed to be stupid. As much as I gripe about the mainstream's view of modern grindhouse films, they aren't really present in the mainstream at all. The sad reality of modern film is that the only movies being seen and covered by critics all that much have high budgets and A-list actors. Grindhouse slashers don't dictate the future of the subgenre, so what does? Before we examine and speculate over the future of slashers, it's important that we define the present. But that's a point of contention. In fact, there is no overarching consensus on where the eras of slashers begin and end. So, for the purposes of this video, I have constructed a timeline of sorts to track the evolution of the slasher subgenre over the 62 years during which it has existed. Slashers originated, as previously mentioned, in 1960 with either Hitchcock's Psycho or Powell's Peeping Tom. Again, it's uncertain which is the true first slasher, but I think it's safe to say they both had a crucial role in shaping the subgenre. Between the releases of these two in 1960 and the releases of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas in 1974, there was a no man's land decade and a half where slashers were loose and rather unpopular. Nothing of any great importance to the slasher subgenre happened within this era. I will deem this the first wave of slashers. When Texas Chainsaw and Black Christmas came out, however, slashers became incredibly popular, especially when following the structure outlined by these two films. This began the slasher craze. I will deem this the second wave of slashers. Somewhere within this slasher craze, filmmakers realized that slashers were cheap, easy, and in demand, so they started churning out some really bad slashers as quickly as they could. This lasted throughout the 80s, and I will deem it the third wave of slashers. As the high-quality slashers died out and the shitty cash grabs multiplied, people began to lose interest in slashers as a whole. The subgenre became known as cheap and exploitative, and as the public stopped watching slashers, filmmakers stopped making them. The temporary death of slashers became fully realized in the early 90s, sucked dry by small-time producers and killed by greed. This was the fourth and final wave of slashers. Nothingness. Slashers, good or bad, were few and far between. All but pre-existing franchises were more or less obsolete. It seemed as if the subgenre was finally over. Holy shit. It's a new century, motherfuckers! Our arbitrary count of time has reached a meaningless milestone, so it's time to cash in and sell out. We are living in the future. Everything has to be reinvented, rebooted, redone in a new, more modern way. Nothing is sacred when everything is behind the times, so what are we waiting for? Every art form, dead or alive, must be revitalized in our new vision. Everything is being introduced for the first time again, and this marketing ploy is working wonders. Horror is seen as brutal by the general public and is being accused of perpetuating violence. You know what? Let's lean into that. Torture porn, guts, murder, we need it all, more depraved than ever before. Hey, I know it would be perfect for this. What was that subgenre that allowed for senseless murder in an easily copied format? Oh yeah, slashers. It's the early 2000s and slashers are back. There's a demand for violence, and the perfect catalyst is being used to no end. This is the fifth wave of slashers. Final Destination, Wrong Turn, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and so many other franchises are being spun into existence. This era has birthed some of the most beloved slashers of all time. But eventually, the boom recedes. The excitement fizzles out. And for the past 10-odd years, we've been in a limbo between something and nothing. Slashers are still being made, but not to a large audience, and not to an amazing reception. The only recently released slashers that could be considered popular are still rather niche, like Hellfest or even Terrifier. The only exceptions are films that exist within pre-established franchises. Today, the present of slashers is unclear, and the future of slashers is abstruse. The only possible clues we have as to the future of the subgenre are the few mainstream slashers to have come out in the past few years. Most notably, Velvet Buzzsaw is a Netflix original film released in 2019 with an all-star cast, including Jake Gyllenhaal, Rene Russo, and Toni Collette. Sporting all the marks of a high-budget film, Velvet Buzzsaw obviously reached a wide audience, but is that a good thing? Being one of the only modern mainstream slashers, it may very well dictate the coming wave of slashers. With that in mind, I find it pertinent to examine Velvet Buzzsaw as it relates to the subgenre. Velvet Buzzsaw follows an art critic, art curator, and other members of the LA art scene as they are stalked and picked off one by one by a supernatural force unleashed by a series of cursed paintings. It's a fun, stupid movie, its only substance being some shallow socio-political commentary. While it's certainly entertaining, it suffers from a multitude of flaws, the most glaring being that it has no tangible main antagonist. The closest thing it has is the Hobo Man, an incredibly intriguing villain I'd like to have seen more of. His lackluster inclusion as a Chekhov's gun just pointed out the missed opportunities. Moreover, the kills are incredibly underwhelming, many off-screen and bloodless. Velvet Buzzsaw seems afraid to show itself as a slasher, while that is certainly what it is. I fear that the new era of slashers it may have begun will follow in its footsteps in being apologetic towards their subgenre. Velvet Buzzsaw is a fine film, but a dreadful influence on the future of slashers. If you want my thoughts on Velvet Buzzsaw as an independent film, you can find them on my Letterboxd, which there is a link to in the description of this video. The upcoming slasher Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey is already getting mainstream attention, since it stars Winnie the Pooh as its antagonist, so I would imagine that it too will heavily influence the new wave of slashers. I cannot stress enough how important it is to the future of the subgenre that this film works well as a slasher and is received both well and widely. If it isn't, the only semi-successful mainstream slasher of the last few years will be one that heavily departs from its own identity. One of these films, either Blood and Honey or Velvet Buzzsaw, will become the modern classic that future slashers are based upon, and I am truly saddened by the idea that those future slashers could be following the lead of Velvet Buzzsaw or something of that caliber. That would either cause serious detriment to the subgenre, or kill it once and for all, another cinematic body to add to the ever-increasing pile as the film industry becomes a macabre slasher in its own right. This may very well be the beginning of the end, at least for slashers, which is why I decided to make this video, serving as either a call to action or as a goodbye, a preemptive eulogy.